You know, people tend to prefer being told they're right. Many YouTube channels adopt positions designed to capture a certain demographic and massage their collective egos in order to generate views, and would never dare to tell that audience that they were wrong for fear of losing them. Meanwhile, I'm going to talk about subjects that I think you'll find interesting in much the way I'd talk to a friend, and just like a friend, we won't always agree. I'll always be presenting these videos as honestly as I can, rather than trying to cater to what I think people might want to hear. I'll be ripping up scripts, including this one, over and over again until I'm happy that they convey what I want them to, and ultimately providing something which I hope is interesting to watch. That's the hope, anyway. So in light of that, here's a good one. Future people will hate you. This is former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Depending on who you ask, he's either a racist war criminal who starved the Indian people, or one of the finest wartime leaders in history, without whom World War II may have had a very different ending. A complete dichotomy. A witty, brave, determined hero worthy of admiration, or a demonstrably evil lunatic. What seems bizarre to me is that those at the extreme ends of this debate almost seem to discount the idea that he was just a guy trying to do what he thought was right. The lens by which we perceive him has little to do with his inner thoughts or goals, and a lot more to do with the consequences and perceptions, both good and ill. And this is just one example of a wider phenomenon. The semi-recent wave in the US and UK of vandalising and tearing statues down follows similar lines of thought, with protesters believing those statues glorified the West's, let's be generous and say, murky colonial past. Whatever your belief on said statues, for there are many more reasons to argue about this that I'm sure people would bring up, it's impossible to claim that the case against them doesn't stem from applying a modern moral ethos to times long before those ethos were developed. People only live in the context of their own time, and the few that do stand out against the zeitgeist of their own era tend to be ridiculed mercilessly. One madman by the name of Ignaz Samowitz believed it was a good idea to clean your hands before delivering children, while the original FBI around Earth propaganda instigator went by the name of Galileo. However, these examples come to us from the realms of science, where answers have become believed due to overwhelming evidence. Although we probably shouldn't tell the flat earthers that, they'd be terribly upset. The point is that we seem to take a strangely narrow view in historical figures. We judge those who went long before us by our current societal standards and condemn them for failing to meet them, refusing to believe they were a good person then if they wouldn't be a good person now, as if it were reasonable to ask them to foresee the way the world would develop and act accordingly. It's especially odd to me given how many of these people who are criticising those of a different era are themselves entirely products of a modern zeitgeist, fitting neatly into a belief structure that has been supplied to them with very little questioning. How can we expect people from the past to be able to adopt opinions that don't fit in with those around them if we don't? It's not as if we ourselves are perfect. Future generations could pick nearly infinite parts of our behaviour to disparage. We exhaust finite natural resources, waste food, buy clothes produced by child labour, eat animals subjected to appalling living conditions in their short, miserable lives. We feed our pets better than poor children. We turn largely blind eyes to famines and slavery, while spending our time belittling those better off than us. We villainise any with differing political views. We bully, we lie, we gossip, we envy, we hate. We enjoy watching people fall, both literally and metaphorically. We watch Love Island, for fuck's sake. So does this mean we can't possibly criticise those from a different time? No. We can still very clearly acknowledge the evils of the past in their own context. Jack the Ripper is not immune from moral disgust any more than any modern serial killer. Context is the key. However, to judge the totality of someone's endeavours based on the worst of them is a standard to which I believe any person would fall. It's no coincidence that we find ways to excuse the villains and anti-heroes in media despite their awful deeds. If someone knew the worst things about you, and only the worst things about you, could they make a fair judgment on your character as a whole? And this is not meant to excuse the inexcusable, merely to introduce balance to narratives often aiming to strawman not just people's ideas but their entire lives. I've already listed some of the things many of us do, and those are only the things I can take a guess at in terms of what may be seen as categorically evil in the future. Perhaps instead we'll see sentiments return to more conservative values, where things like having sex outside of wedlock will be condemned. Who knows what will be the cultural norm 10 years from now, let alone several hundred. In a recent stand-up set, Ricky Gervais noted that people's old tweets often get brought up in order to condemn them by today's standards. He notes that one of the most offensive things you could have said in the days of early Twitter was, women don't have cocks. But nobody would have even thought to say that at the time, because in the wider political sphere, it wasn't a contentious thing to say, it was just an accepted idea. Within recent memory, the perception of the phrase women don't have cocks went from too obvious to bother saying to one of the most offensive things you could say. A decade or so ago, TERFs were the core progressive left-wing ideology. Now they are lambasted by the new left-wing for their position on trans rights. Things can change very quickly. So how do you know that what you're saying now, what you truly in your heart believe to be a moral absolute right, will be viewed so favourably in the future? You may well be the villain in the future, that is, if you're not right now. Philosopher Peter Singer wrote a controversial paper claiming the average person is evil. Perhaps his views become the norm 200 years from now, and that doesn't exactly bode well for us. This is all before you really look at the wider view of morality as a tool for social control. Moral certainty has traditionally been used to mobilize people to do terrible things. Perhaps the most obvious example is war, where the certainty that we are right and they are wrong is used to inspire hatred and contempt enough to justify slaughter. And it seems that what once served commanders well in a military battlefield is instead being deployed on political ones. Increasingly we see echo chambers lacking any sort of honest critique being formed. Constantly we see people completely incapable of entertaining the idea that the views that they have been prescribed may be flawed. Anyone who claims to have all the answers is wrong, and this includes me. I'm not a moral arbiter telling you what to believe. I'm really asking you to really think about it for yourself. Essentially, call your own bullshit. It's easy to see how society pushes you to extremes. I see it all the time right here on YouTube. Now, if you've been sitting thinking, I hope he doesn't start talking about algorithms again, Look, I promise not every video is going to have algorithms in it. I'll suddenly have very right-wing media fed my way proclaiming sophisticated views such as immigrants are bad. Conversely, on other days I'll be fed pseudo-communist sentiments about how capitalism and white people are responsible for all of the wrongs in the world. It seems very easy to be pushed into radicalization if we aren't careful about examining what we're being shown. The ability to shut out contradictory views and simply villainize anyone who disagrees with us leads to frightening levels of obnoxious complacency and delusion, and also a tidy money-making operation. People who are as self-assured as they are ignorant of the full spectrum of possible philosophical viewpoints. Even as I model a person like that, I'll wager many of you are thinking of either a person or a group of people who hold views you disagree with. Well, even if you yourself are a glorious free thinker and presumable member of the PC master race, I promise that there are people out there who think largely the same way you do, with little to no actual thought involved. The current internet thrives on the feelings of rage and vindication. Make people feel rage towards extreme examples of people who disagree with them, followed by pushing them into the waiting arms of echo chambers. I had one merry echo chamber leave swathes of comments on my Dragon Age video that very clearly indicated they hadn't watched it before commenting. And this is the reality. Snap judgments and emotional reactions. Thankfully it's not the case for everyone just yet, but no matter what you believe, it's quite something to believe your viewpoints are beyond reproach. The arrogance that our current ideals are so correct that we can judge, but ourselves are beyond judgment is staggeringly naive. A false moral high ground, a false summit of ever-changing moral sentiment. Not only do we not have a historical consensus on morality, we don't have a consensus on morality in the modern world. Not within countries, not between countries, often not between members of one household. Yet we endeavour to examine those born in an entirely different moral landscape and judge them as if they were living now, privy to the ideas we happen to have grown up with. The simple reality is, had you been around back then, it's staggeringly unlikely that you'd have the same moral ideas you have now, for much the same reason that it's very unlikely you share the moral viewpoint of someone several hundred years into the future. If we're going to judge people of the past in this way, we must know that people in the future will do the same to us. They can also pick out one societal norm to dismiss our entire lives with, all the good we tried to do. No, we'll be branded as evil, and that is, if we're even remembered at all. So really, the only hope for future people not to be judgmental of us devoid of context would be for us to realise how cheap and unfair it is for us to think of the past this way. We at least should try to avoid the cherry picking of sweeping narratives we allow to inform an entire opinion on a multifaceted individual. Returning to Churchill, he wasn't one thing or the other, there are elements of both. The subject of starvation in Bengal is one to be treated with the utmost sincerity. Wartime decisions based on fear of losing resources that were needed to win the war led to at least 3 million people people dying of hunger. It's horrific. And terrible decisions that had to be made in wartime can be debated with hindsight in our comfortable positions of never having to make calls that end lives. Churchill's decisions led to millions of agonizing deaths and traumatized survivors, and this is not only restricted to Bengal. My family lost people at the Gallipoli campaign, which was Churchill's failed First War initiative. In contrast, his inspirational leadership during World War II is credited as a crucial element to the Allies prevailing over the evils of Nazi Germany. These things are true at the same time. It's not some comic book with black and white heroes and villains. I grew up never hearing about the Bengal part of Churchill's legacy because of the simplistic narrative of a war hero. When I learned more, my view became more nuanced, rather than attempting to reject any information that didn't fit in with what I already knew. That's the whole point. Complexity isn't a vice, it's a necessity, without which we'll be forever susceptible to naive conclusions lacking any true insight. Painting Churchill in such simplistic terms will always serve to miss the truth in favour of an easy narrative. This summary itself is far too short, missing too much crucial detail. This video isn't really about Churchill's legacy in particular. If it was, it would have to be far, far longer. I'm merely using Churchill as an example of a historical figure who tends to be simplistically viewed one way or the other. This topic, like many others, deserves time and detail, which is exactly why it's so incredibly fake to simply cut out one tiny sliver and judge everything on that. Yet, that is the trend of modern society. Hear one detail, make a snap judgment, and stick to that judgment. Of course we end up with radical wings entrenched in simplistic, ill-observed viewpoints when we allow political and moral narratives to be so cheap. It's why I mentioned those YouTube channels pandering to groups in the beginning. The surgical removal of anything you don't want to hear will keep us all in a state of willing ignorance, incapable of perceiving anything outside of our strict, narrow-minded filters. It's the antithesis of enlightenment, a sick subservience to dogma, a regression in the great human pursuit of wisdom. To put it simply, it's beneath us. And as I said, I don't want to present myself as some moral arbiter telling everyone how to behave, merely to point out the issues with this way of thinking I've seen become increasingly popular. Returning to the start, I hope future people don't hate us, because it will mean that they are not learning from the mistakes of the past they choose to condemn. An amusing case of history repeating itself. I'd like to think we can go beyond this cycle, but currently that's not the case. Alright, I was supposed to do a cheerier video again. Happy holidays?